Thank you so much for coming on Northern Vibe, Father. I'm really keen on chatting.
Very good. Thanks for having me, Matt. Lovely.
Well, look, there's some events that's been happening down there in Canberra that the ACT, that we kind of really don't know much about up here in North Queensland. And I really want you to elucidate on it. So I'll just ask you a couple of contextual questions so people understand what's going on. First, I'll just get you to explain compulsory acquisition laws. They exist for the government to acquire land. And for what reasons and circumstances can the government acquire land in the Australian Capital Territory?
Well, they're like the other states, they're like the other territory. Northern Territory, they in their land acquisition acts, they usually have a section for compulsory acquisitions, and the reason given is normally for the common good. So they might be wanting to drive a road through somewhere, they might be wanting to put a new airport in somewhere for the common good. And so they're instructed to do these compulsory acquisitions according to their rule of law on just terms. The just terms is basically the way you do the proper negotiations, the mutuality of each party, and then you look at the just terms in terms of the financial compensation. So that's the way it's done. All governments have the authority to do it, but they've got to do them the right way. Absolutely.
Absolutely. And for the right reasons, which is what I'm trying to get at here. So,
yeah.
The sorts of things you've spoken about are basically infrastructure related. It's like, so we have to put a road through here. We have to do something like that. It's kind of not ideological. Now, can you tell us about Calvary Hospital, its history, its background, where it is, what it does?
Yeah, certainly. So Calvary Hospital was run by the Little Sisters of the Poor. They came out here in the 19th century, Catholic religious order, and their main game is to do medical services, hospitals, etc., and care of the poor. Little Sisters of the Poor, that's their name. So they've done that. And then in 1971, the federal government, which was then looking after Canberra, the nation's capital, began negotiations with them to say, look, would you come and run a hospital here, an alternate public hospital to the main public hospital? And the idea was to try and help public servants come out of Melbourne and Sydney to the nation's capital. So the attraction was if they've got another alternate public health system, they're more likely to come because health's a big thing in life. So they came in 1979. They developed the Calvary Hospital on a 120-year lease. So the lease is for the land, and they built the buildings, obviously, and then they had a contract to supply medical services for 120 years. So that's the context, that's the history. So the federal government brought them in, and of course in 1989, the federal government established the ACT government, the territory government here in 1989. That's the history.
Calvary Hospital is now subject to compulsory acquisition. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, well, they've done it. They did it on the 3rd of July. They introduced the legislation late the 28th of May, I think it was late May, gave us 6 weeks, and they took everything. They ripped up the service agreement, took the land, took the buildings on the 3rd of July, compulsory acquisition. And they did this by suspending their own standing orders. So any bill that goes through the Parliament or the Assembly, as it's known here, is subject to a 2-month period of discussion, reports, inquiries, etc. They said, we don't have to have that. And they said, furthermore, we won't even do this according to our Land Acquisition Act of 1994. We'll just introduce a bill into Parliament. And because the Greens and Labor have a majority, they just rammed it through. So it was certainly done very, very quickly and very unjustly. And people are rightly worried to say and asking the question, if you can deal with a medical institution here in Canberra, you could deal with an educational institution, and you could do it right around the country. So it's set a precedent, and it's very, very poor behaviour on behalf of the government, no question.
Well, I don't think it's much of an exaggeration to say they've kind of lawfully stolen it, really. Now, okay, but we do understand that the government does have the ability to acquire land. For what reason? Well, what reasons were given initially for the acquisition of the hospital? And is there any dissonance between the actual reasons?
So they said that they wanted a more integrated health system. Okay, so that was the reason that they gave.
Mm-hmm. What does that mean in practice?
Who would know? Because their main hospital, the Canberra Hospital, is functions in some way, but otherwise it doesn't function. There's a lot of stories about it. So no one really knows what that means. I mean, what I think happened here is that they did a survey about abortion. How is abortion being provided for in the territory in Canberra, the territory? And they did a study of this, and they put out a report in April 2023. Right at the beginning of the report, it acknowledges that neither the main public hospital nor Calvary Public Hospital, as it was then known, provided abortions. Neither of them did it, because most of the abortions are out to private medical clinics in the city. And this is the case right across Australia. And yet at the back end of the report, it said that, there's a real problem in a sense that, Calvary supplies medical services with too much of a religious overtone. So that was the clue to it all. So they gave us assurances in discussion. Oh, no, it's not about religion. But I think it really was. And they've been planning this for some time. So we had the health minister at the federal Senate inquiry last Monday say, we began the legislation in March 2023. In fact, through freedom of information, a Canberra Times journalist said, no, it actually began in May 2022. So it's quite disingenuous. The reasons given are for that's the public reason for an integrated public health system. That's not true at all. I think it was done because of religious reasons. Yeah.
Okay. So, and look.
But there's more activity happening in this space with the other publicly funded Catholic hospitals. There's 15 around the country. We'll come to that later, what's happening there in that space now.
Yeah. But see, this really is the touchstone. This sets the precedent, and there's so many issues around here that I'm really, really interested in. Now, obviously, being a Catholic, I'm anti-abortion. But one thing that I would hope that all listeners of Northern Vibe, because I have a lot of secular people listening, would understand that something that's very important is the primacy of conscience. So if someone doesn't want to work for an institution or an organisation that provides a service that goes against their conscience, that they shouldn't have to. And furthermore, if someone wants to go to a place to be treated by people that they feel comfortable with, that they're aligned with, they should be able to do that. Now, outside of religious practices in the Indigenous context, that's called cultural safety and cultural appropriateness. So me personally, and I know I'm editorializing here, I just can't see how and why it's fair, reasonable, logic, or consistent to take a hospital off people because they don't want to provide abortion. That seems to be the argument.
Yeah, well, no, in fact, that's not the argument, because no abortions not performed in the main public hospital here, and it's not Calvary. So abortion's not the reason for it. That's why I highlighted that other comment.
Right.
So this is the case right around the country. This is actually about freedom of religion, and it's about protecting people, whether they happen to be Catholics or Anglicans or Uniting or no faith. If they've got institutions, the governments want to stroll in and say, we're going to take it off you. So it had little to do with abortion. I think it had everything to do with the fact that it was run by a Catholic institution whom the government doesn't like, because the chief minister down here is on record as saying, I don't want freedom for religion, I want freedom from religion. Well, he's shooting himself in the foot there, because the Australian Constitution is very clear about this. There's a section in the Constitution, which is 116, and it was put into the Constitution by the founders of the Constitution, who were not very religious at all, in fact.
No.
Some of them, yes, they had a vague belief in God. A couple were Christians, not many, but they were convinced that the first fundamental right in life is the right to life, but then the second fundamental right is the right to search for the meaning of life. Now, that would be true whether you're an atheist or a Catholic or a Jew or Islamic or Buddhist or whatever, that you've got to have a right to, okay, I've got a right to life, then I've got a right to search for the meaning of life. And that's why this is such an important issue, that it's saying, well, that's actually not a right now. We're going to walk right over you because you actually hold this belief, which you hold in community. And of course, the Catholic Church around the country is about 25% of the population, and it's the biggest employer outside of government in terms of education and health. So this is quite a serious issue. So everyone ought to be frightened, whether they happen to be believers or unbelievers. And this is the really important point. The 2 points that are being highlighted here, I think, are quite clear. One is legitimate property rights, which is essential to a free and fair nation, or a fair and free nation, or free and fair, whichever way you want to look at it. And the second is freedom of religion, the freedom that people have to search for the meaning of life in and through community life. It's very important. So if we flout this particular provision of the Constitution and this particular right that people have, not only will people like the Catholics have just suffered, but everyone in the Federation will suffer as well. People need to be really clear about this.
Yeah, Pastor Nehemiah. First they came for the Catholics. Yeah,
That's right.
okay. So it's just the fact, and I want to articulate this correctly to make sure I've got it correct in my head. It's just the fact that it's an institution that is religious. That's just it. Just the fact that this institution that has a religious foundation and a religious face exists. It's not as even if they're doing something that
Right.
that is a contentious thing, and that is a contentious thing, and some people don't agree with.
Yeah, well, see, I was interviewed by Ray Hadley, and Ray Hadley's not a Catholic, and he'd had treatment in the Seventh-day Adventist Hospital in Sydney, and his kids had all been a lot of Catholic hospitals. And he said, look, we received the best care ever, and we didn't have religion shoved down our throats. So when that report said that I referred to earlier, the report, they're offering medical service with too much of a religious overtone. It's quite bizarre. It's ridiculous. I mean, everyone that goes there wants to be treated well medically, and they can sense that the reason for the medical treatment is inspired by values higher than themselves. In other words, God or a religious tradition. And that's true of the Catholic Church. It's true of other churches, and it's true of people with no faith. Sometimes they're inspired to do things for humanity, and that's fantastic, and that should be honoured. But here we have we're not going to respect that. Now, I said at the beginning of this that the big problem here is it sets a precedent. So we had the Prime Minister come out and say everything's fine, and I couldn't believe it. I could not believe that the Prime Minister of the country, a Labor Prime Minister, came out with such thought patterns. I mean, you imagine Paul Keating or Bob Hawke doing it, or to go further back in time to Ben Chifley or John Curtin?
No way.
There's no world that they would have done it. They would have protected those rights. And so what's happening now is we've got the Guardian newspaper here in Australia going on a fishing expedition, and they're saying, well, all the other 15 publicly funded Catholic hospitals, tell us your story about not being able to access abortion or reproductive services. And yet those hospitals, like the main public hospitals, don't do abortion because abortion's an elective procedure. So they're saying, they're trying to hide under their religious beliefs. Well, not at all. So they're completely disingenuous and untruthful in what they're doing here. So we have to fight not only on behalf of ourselves, but on behalf of every other Australian that wants a fair and free country.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you're right though too. I mean, they've kind of got a point in so much as if you conceptualize God as love, the source of love and the source of life, and you're inspired by that, then yes, your institution, it's not, like you said, it's not shoved down your face, it's not shoved down your throat, but you in an environment that is fundamentally religious and fundamentally based on the religious values of Christianity. And the answer to that question is yes. Yes, it is. And we do that proudly. That's who we are. That's what we do. That's how we roll. But look, I'm going to make a series of comments, and I'd like you to kind of get you to speak about them around this. Now, obviously the government really does believe that the public needs to be protected from Christianity generally, but especially the Catholic Church. That's clearly what's going on here. Now, one of the examples I would use as evidence of that is conversion theory, which in practice is little more than people who don't want to act on their homosexual urges being counseled and prayed over. Now, that's been criminalized. Now, so much for consenting adults being allowed to do what they want to do behind closed doors, bye-bye to that axiom. But in my mind, the hypocrisy goes even deeper. Now, I work a little bit in the mental health space, and in 2020, there was a Commonwealth Productivity Commission inquiry into mental health. Now, this report's going to shape national policy and action on the current suicide epidemic. Good thing. But Action 8.3 says, undertake an evaluation of programs that use traditional healers in partnership with conventional mental health services. Now, it sounds nice, but let's break this down. Let's think about this. What is traditional? Well, we're talking about the mental health space. So it's not going to be some wise old elder in Cape York, where I live and I've worked, who may actually have some residual knowledge of herbs that are going to make boils and sores heal quicker or that kind of thing. What it's going to mean in practice is a couple of things. Like I said, it's mental health. So there's a real overlay between mental illness and spiritual health. So first, traditional healing is going to have to mean reviving traditional religion and spiritual practices and empowering their practitioners. Okay, so in essence, so if this goes ahead and becomes state funded, and I need to make the clarification that it's not yet, but it certainly has the potential to, and I don't think it's going too much out on a limb to say that it's been implied and suggested by the Productivity Commission they'd like to see something like this happen. The state is going to fundamentally fund a return of whatever it is post-contact mishmash is defined as traditional Aboriginal religion. And, again, who's going to do that? Well, it's going to be a Commonwealth committee. And so you're going to have you're going to have a funding and a religious value that's not Christian embedded into this practice. Now, secondly, obviously you're going to, because it's not like, even homeopathy has a kind of guild which looks after, they can license people and say, well, you're in the homeopathy or whatever it is. But you're going to get this is opening the doors to, people who can say pretty much anything and say that it's traditional. So, I suspect that you're going to find, Bruce Pascoe-like discoveries that Indigenous Australians were right into crystal healing, energy field healing, psychic surgery, Reiki. And so you think of the potential that these people are going to be practicing on the most vulnerable and disadvantaged in our society. But the same people, Father, that are criminalizing not even religious practice. So as you point out, it's not as even if you were saying we don't do abortions. It's just the fact that there's a religious ethic and overtone to this. The same people that are criminalizing our practice and excluding Catholics from healthcare are now encouraging Indigenous pagan spirituality. And I can tell you from working in Cape York extensively that means sorcery, that means curses, and everything else that comes with it. So, and look, well, I'll just get you to comment on that before I go further.
Well, I think that, as you're sort of talking now, I think that there's a couple of issues here. One is that what you've got is in society, you've got in developed societies like ours, you've got governments and you've got the individual. And in between, you've got these intermediary institutions. And these things are very, very important. Now, it was John Howard, the former Prime Minister of Australia, who someone said this to me when I first heard it. I thought this sounds a bit not, it doesn't sound quite right or quite true, that Menzies' greatest achievement was the funding of schools, private schools, which included Catholic schools. And I thought that was not so much extreme, but I just didn't think it was quite on the money. But now, having been involved with this Calvary issue, I now realise it's actually probably true, because you've got to have, if you want a fair and free society, you've got to have the government and you've got to have the individual. But in the middle, you've got to have all these intermediary institutions that actually have a different take and a different way of doing things than governments do. Otherwise, you do have rampant socialism. The government just fills in the vacuum and the individual gets crushed while they're at it. All that in the history with socialism. It was begun in 1917, and by 1989, the wall collapsed. The great symbol of communism came crashing down, and what was revealed there? Well, abject poverty. Poverty, and not only poverty, material poverty, but spiritual poverty. Had tried to take God away from the people, and left them with nothing. So actually, what's at stake here is the government's not doing everything. Of course, it works both ways. The governments can be too forceful, so we've got to kick back on them. But also, we can be too lazy, and not be involved enough in these social settings, whether it happens to be a church or a scout group or a sporting club. We've got to help people get involved. So it can be our problem too. So it works both ways. That's the first point I'd make about what you said. The second point, I think, is just as important, that people are making up truth. The truth is a tremendous casualty here. because everyone is just relying on their own sort of minds to get to truth, and this is not good. So we're getting history being fabricated, and we're getting all sorts of weirdo ideas about what can be done and what can't be done. I mean, in this whole identity, this whole identity politics, I made a joke the other day to some friends. I said, I was born in 1963, so I'm not a pensioner. And I said, I'm identifying as a pensioner. So I go down to Centrelink and the bloke says, oh, you're identifying as a pensioner, are you? Right, where's your birth certificate? So I give the birth certificate and he says, mate, you're not a pensioner. You were born in 1963. See you later, buddy. And it just highlights the stupidity of what's happening. Absolutely. With people identifying as this or that or whatever. It's not true. And of course, as human beings, we're body, soul, and spirit. So the traditional definition of truth is the conformity of the mind with reality. But that's absolutely a perfectly good definition. But it's somewhat inadequate because it's not only the mind, it's body, soul, and spirit. Mm. So it's conformity with who we are bodily. It's the conformity with reality. Mm. With our minds, our memories, our wills, our memories are this, they're not this. We can't lie about our memories, they're true. And then you've got the whole sense of the spirit, our capacity for God. Absolutely. And that's very important to line that up. So I think that this is quite a serious issue. I read a book recently by a woman called Abigail Favale. I read her conversion story. Then I read her book on, it's called The Genesis of Gender. And I hadn't realized that she said a lot of this modern stuff, they're saying truth is power. Truth is power. Truth is power I have over you, but that's not what truth is. Truth is liberty. Truth leads to freedom and love, and it leads to communities and people respecting each other. But truth is power is to be dismissed because they're making up the truth as they go. So I think this is a great moment to be alive. I think there's great changes happening in the world, and I think if we can not be opposed to every single change, but if we can say to people, listen, we've got to stand on some solid foundations, and here they are, present them to people. I think we should have every confidence that we can go forward well to 2050 and 2100. But we've got to have some courage. I think we've got to have competence in the field, as obviously you have, and then have courage to speak out. Yeah, I think it's the difference between being reasonable and sort of being purely rational. And reason, of course, is able to incorporate, the whole emotional life. I mean, if you look at the writings of St. Thomas Aquinas, perhaps one of the greatest, or the greatest theologian the church has had, it's because he understood how reason and faith work together and how we acknowledge everything that we are as created people. So, for instance, he had this fantastic section in Summa on human emotion. It's the most systematic account of human emotion in literature, philosophy, or theology by anyone. It's incredible. And we use it. I was the rector of the major seminary in Sydney for a number of years under Cardinal Pell, and we use that in our first year program for the seminarians to help them mature emotionally and as young men. But Aquinas had worked this out back in the 13th century, and it's sort of, there's a new flourishing of it now in the late 20th century and coming into the 21st century. And of course, one of the benefits we have now is we've got so many empirical studies at hand that actually prove a lot of our moral teaching, for instance. Like people say, well, the indissolubility of marriage, but economically and sociologically, it's quite clear that it's much better for people to stick together. I'm not saying that those that have had a divorce are going to be condemned, not at all. But I mean that the point is that it's much better if people stick together, and that the research sort of backs it up. So I think with those things in mind, we can really go forward, I think. And I think if we've got a lot of people working in different fields and with this type of attitude, we should look forward to a good future, a bright future.
I hear what you said before about the funding, and that's a discussion in and of itself. I'm not suggesting turn all the taps off, but when you're a piper and you get paid, you pay the tune that the piper that the people who are paying you want to pay.
Yeah, well, Australia's first St. Mary MacKillop, St. Mary of the Cross, they refused government funding for their schools because she thought that by taking on the funding, they would take on the values of the secular city. And there's a sense where she's right about that for sure. But of course, if you took it away, then I think Howard's point is right. If you take away those intermediary institutions, which particularly in education and health, which have different ways of delivering and different ways of looking at things, then you take away a great variety and you sort of take away a competition with the state itself. So yes, I think wholesale government funding is not a good idea, but a mix of it probably is. But as you say, the money comes with strings attached to it. And if it comes to the point where you say, well, we are not going to do what the government is asking because it's against our conscience, then you say, right, well, we're not going to be doing this unless we can raise the money. So we've got to be true to what we believe, and we've got to do the right thing. I mean, we're now seeing right across the nation, I mean, the outrage at Qantas, who have supplied 8,000 cancelled flights. They cancelled 8,000 flights and still took money for a month after it in many cases, and pocketed all the money, even though they knew themselves they weren't going to deliver that flight. Well, that's fraud. That's complete and utter fraud. And that's the sort of behaviour we've got to avoid. And I think with the loss of the sense of faith, as you mentioned before, what inevitably happens is there's a loss of the moral code, and that's not good.
So and also that, because I mean, if people are looking for the government to do everything for themselves, they become dependent on the government, and they disempower themselves.
Yeah, and that was the import of Menzies' famous forgotten people addresses, which I might advertise my book here now, if you don't mind, called Australia, What Went Right, What Went Wrong. It's a very small book based on David Kemp's monumental 5-volume book on Australian cultural history. And I just put it in a nice little monograph, really, just 18,000 words, particularly written for young people, get them involved in political and public life. And in that book, you'll find the little summary of what Menzies said there about the dangers of an overarching state. Very, very important point that he made.
So there it is, and it's available through Connor Court.
Yes, it is.
If you just Google it, and $22, that's pretty good. This is about those people, about all people anywhere, being able to build institutions, and of course, that reflect their own values. And of course, that means Indigenous people too, although they're disproportionately Christian, so they'd actually probably be happy with institutions like ours. But if you want to build something that reflects your culture and your values, well,
yeah.
At any moment, the government might come along and go, you know what, we kind of don't approve.
There's that beautiful thing up in Torres Strait where they have a public holiday. It's called the Coming of the Light, when they celebrate the Protestant missionaries who came up there and brought faith. And the Aboriginal people have a great receptivity to faith. And I recently spoke to some wonderful Aboriginal women about their faith in the Eucharist, because they've got truckloads of faith. So no, it's all going. It's sort of an interesting time, as I said before, but time of great change. Therefore, it's a great time of opportunity for all of us. And I wish you all the best with your